"I pity you," she said. Julian Hastings, 9th Duke of Merrow, had been shaking hands in a garden for 40 minutes, and those were the first words spoken to him that afternoon that were not a condolence, an inquiry, or a soft, careful question about the harvest. He did not quite believe he had heard them. He had been standing at the edge of his Aunt Lavinia's rose walk with a cup of tea that he had not drunk. The cup had been placed in his hand by a slight young woman in a dove-grey dress who had not waited for him to thank her. She had simply set the saucer against his palm, folded the cup's handle toward his fingers, and taken a step back. Now she was looking at him with a steady, considering expression that contained neither deference nor flirtation, only a quiet, unembellished assessment, as if she had weighed a sack of flour. "I beg your pardon," Julian said. "I pity you," she repeated. "Your Grace." The "Your Grace" was perfectly timed. It arrived half a breath after the sentence it belonged to, so that it felt less like a courtesy and more like a correction, as if she had remembered, only at the last moment, that she was not permitted to address a duke without his title. Her voice was low and even. Not insolent. Not angry. Merely clear. Behind her, through the white roses and the scatter of black-gloved mourners, someone was laughing. Someone else, the widow in heavy crepe, her face ruined, was weeping quietly into a handkerchief while her mother-in-law held her by the elbow. A spaniel had stolen a sandwich from the low buffet table and was being chased around the sundial by a small boy in a black jacket. Henry had died 6 months ago. Today was the memorial. Julian realized he had not moved in several seconds. "That," he said, "is an unusual thing to say." "Yes, Your Grace," she agreed. She was not pretty in the conventional sense. Her hair was a middling brown, pinned back tightly beneath a modest bonnet that had plainly been brushed that morning and brushed again. Her eyes were a clear light grey, set wide in an oval face. Her nose was small and neat. Her mouth, which was neither smiling nor tight, was wider than it should have been, and gave her face a strange, candid openness. Her dress was well made, but 3 seasons out of fashion. Her gloves had been mended at the seam on the right thumb. The second finger of her right hand was faintly stained with ink at the nail. And her bearing, he noted while he gathered himself, was not the bearing of a lady. Not the bearing of a servant, either. Something between. The bearing of a person who had been taught to stand still so that other people could look at her without being made uncomfortable. He had seen that bearing before, in the poor relation cousins of his mother's acquaintance. Companions. Governesses. The women who made great houses run without being paid enough to sit at their tables. "Who are you?" Julian said. "Alice Carruthers, Your Grace. I read to Lady Lavinia in the mornings, and I answer her correspondence in the afternoons." "My aunt's companion." "Yes, Your Grace." "And you pity me?" "Yes, Your Grace." He considered her. 40 feet away, through a gap in the roses, his cousin Felix was saying something to the vicar that required both hands. A bee was moving stupidly across the buffet table, settling on a jam tart. The sun, which had been behind a cloud for most of the service, came out with the sudden thoroughness of English summer, and the garden turned gold. "May I ask?" Julian said. "Why?" Alice Carruthers did not answer immediately. She looked instead at the cup of tea in his hand, which had gone cold. Then she looked at his face. "Your friend's widow, Mrs. Whitney, has wept 3 times in the last hour, Your Grace," she said. "Once at the church door, when she saw the yew wreath. Once in the carriage on the way here. I walked alongside it, and the window was open. Once just now, at the garden gate. And I have been in Lady Lavinia's service since February. I read aloud to her every letter you have written her since Mr. Whitney's death. I know the dates, and the contents, and the length, and the hand. You haven't wept, Your Grace. Not in a letter. Not in company. I pity you because grief that is not permitted does not go away. It stays, and it eats the person who is forbidden to have it. She paused. Her grey eyes did not waver. That is why, she said. Then she curtsied, a small, perfectly executed curtsy, the bob of a woman who knew precisely how much respect was owed, and walked away across the grass toward the house, her skirt brushing the edge of the rose bed, her back straight, her hands folded at her waist. Julian stood very still. The teacup in his hand had a chip on the rim, a little crescent where the glaze had flaked. He had not noticed before. He noticed now. He was 32 years old, and he was the 9th Duke of Merrow, and a woman whose annual salary was less than the cost of his coat had just told him, in a rose garden full of his friends' mourners, that his grief was eating him. He set the teacup down, very carefully, on the edge of the stone bench beside him. His hand was trembling. 3 hours later, Julian sat in the morning room of Merrow Court, his own house, his aunt's nearest neighbour by 4 miles, and stared at the signet ring on his left hand without seeing it. Well, his cousin Felix said, from the window, where he was watching the last carriage roll down the avenue in a cloud of August dust. That was not the worst memorial I have ever attended. Aunt Lavinia served the good cake. The vicar only wept twice. Mrs. Whitney bore up. Your speech at the graveside was, I thought, exactly the right length. 7 minutes. I timed you. Did you? I did. One does. Felix turned from the window. He was 3 years younger than Julian, dark-haired and thin, with the high colour and quick gaze of a man whose health had almost killed him twice in boyhood, and who now behaved as if every good afternoon were an unearned gift. Merrow, you are grey. It was a long day. You are not drinking your brandy. No. Felix came away from the window and took the chair opposite. He lifted his own brandy, sniffed it, and put it down untouched, which was, Julian noticed distantly, something Felix did only when he meant to pay attention. Something at the house, Felix said. Aunt Lavinia has a companion. Yes, Miss Carruthers. Been there since January or February. A clergyman's daughter from Ludlow. I checked, because Aunt Lavinia's last companion was a disaster. Quiet girl. Plain as a wren. Lavinia's quite attached. Why? She spoke to me today. Felix waited. Julian, to his own surprise, did not want to say the words aloud. The sentence had been sitting in his chest for 3 hours, solid as a stone, saying it would make the day real. She told me, he said carefully, that she pitied me. Felix's eyebrows rose, a slow, interested rise, no laughter behind it. Did she? He said. She did. And what occasioned that? Julian told him. He told him in order, the tea, the curtsy, the grey eyes, the count of Mrs. Whitney's tears, the thing about the letters. When he was finished, Felix was no longer sitting. Felix was standing by the fireplace, staring down into the empty grate. Julian, Felix said, eventually, without turning around. She is not wrong. I know. You haven't wept. I noticed in February. I did not say. I know. We all noticed. I know, Felix. A long silence. The mantel clock ticked. Somewhere in the house, probably the library, a door closed, and Julian recognized with an odd jolt that it was his mother returning from her own afternoon calls. He did not particularly want to see his mother this evening. Julian, Felix said again, and now he had turned to look at him. I thought you were managing. You have been punctual, efficient. You sat in Parliament in May and made a speech about the Corn Laws that cost you 4 friendships you will not get back for 10 years. You have the estate books in better order than our father ever did. You answered every condolence letter in your own hand. I thought, we all thought, the duty was carrying you. The duty is carrying me. No, Felix said quietly. The duty is eating you. That is not the same thing. The wren was right. Julian said nothing. The duty was eating him. He knew that, in the private part of his mind, he did not ordinarily visit. He had known it in Parliament, when he had stood up to speak and had felt, for a long, shocking moment, that he did not remember who he was. He had known it in the estate office at dawn, when his steward had told him some minor thing about a roof, and he had heard himself answer in a voice that did not belong to him. He had known it every time he had sat down at Henry's old writing desk in the library. Henry had liked that desk. Henry had come to Merrow Court 3 times a year since they were 8 years old, and had always written his letters from that desk, and had picked up a pen and written, efficiently and courteously, to Henry's widow. He had not once written to her as a man who had lost his friend. He had written to her as a duke who had lost a neighbour. "Felix," Julian said. "What should I do?" Felix considered him for a moment. Then he said, "Go and apologize to her." "To Mrs. Whitney?" "No, to the wren." It was not, strictly speaking, a thing a duke did, ride 4 miles through an August evening in a clean coat to apologize to a companion. It was not a thing Julian's mother would have approved of if she had known. It was not a thing his father, had his father still been alive, would have permitted. But his father was not alive, and his mother, through the long walls of a country house, had no particular idea where he was, and Felix had said, "Go," and Julian had gone. He rode Marius, the grey gelding Henry had given him as a wedding present 4 years ago, before Henry had been Henry the married man, and Julian had been Julian the younger brother, and the world had been entirely different, down the lane between his fields. The wheat had been cut that week, and stood in stooks in the fields, gold and black shadowed in the declining light. A pair of pigeons burst out of a hedge as he passed, and clattered away across the sky. The air smelled of stubble and dust and the cooling day. He had not, he realized, ridden alone for pleasure in 6 months. Not once. He reached Aunt Lavinia's gate at 7:30. The lodgekeeper's wife, who had known him since he was in short trousers, curtsied without showing any surprise. Julian was an accustomed visitor, and opened the gate, and said that her ladyship was still at the dressing hour, and would be down in 20 minutes. Would his grace prefer the drawing-room or the garden? Julian said the garden, and dismounted, and gave Marius's reins to the undergroom who had materialized out of a hedge, and walked, by himself, down the path he had walked in the morning. The rose walk was empty. The black-gloved mourners had gone hours ago. Someone, Aunt Lavinia's gardener, presumably, had tidied the sundial. The stone bench, where Julian had set down the chipped teacup, was bare. The woman was at the end of the walk. She was kneeling, with her skirt carefully folded under her, beside the low boxwood hedge that ran along the garden's southern wall. A wicker basket sat beside her on the grass. She was cutting something from the hedge with a pair of small shears. As Julian approached, he saw that it was not flowers, but the spent heads of lavender, which stood in a long soldierly row behind the boxwood, pale purple fading now to grey. She was not, he observed, wearing the dove-grey dress she had worn in the morning. She was wearing a plain blue cotton that was considerably older, and an apron of worn linen and a wide straw hat. Her hands, ungloved now, and strong and capable, moved steadily along the row. A small bowl beside her was filling with dried lavender heads. She had not heard him approach. He was within 10 feet of her before her shears paused. "Good evening, Miss Carruthers," he said. She turned her head. She did not, he noticed, exhibit any of the conventional signals: the startled rise, the flushed cheek, the flutter of the hand to the throat. She looked at him steadily over her shoulder, from her kneeling position, and appeared to absorb the information that a duke was standing 10 feet from her in a countess's garden on a Thursday evening in August, and nodded. "Your Grace," she said. "I have come," Julian said, "to apologize." She did not rise. She lowered the shears. "For what, Your Grace?" He had prepared a speech on the ride over. He had prepared, in fact, 3 speeches. The first, a thoroughly eloquent one about the proper boundaries of rank and the impropriety of her remark. The second, a shorter one expressing, with dignity, that her observation had none the less contained a germ of truth. The third, which he had discarded twice, and then returned to, a very simple one that said she had been correct, and that he had not been ready to hear it, but was ready now. All 3 speeches left him the moment he saw her ungloved hands on the lavender. "For being too dull," he said, "to thank you at once." Then he stopped, because he had not meant to say that. He had meant to say something else entirely. For a moment, neither of them moved. She knelt with the shears in her hand. He stood, hat in hand, the last of the sunlight coming through the lime trees behind him and striking along the edge of the boxwood. A single bee was working the lavender. Then, very slowly, Alice Carruthers smiled. It was a small smile. It was not a smile of triumph or of pleasure. It was, he thought afterwards, a smile of recognition, as if she had been waiting to see whether he was the kind of man who could say that sentence without choking on it, and had found her answer. "You are welcome, Your Grace," she said. He stayed in the garden for 40 minutes. He did not, he would later reflect, have the faintest idea what had possessed him. He had asked whether he might help her cut the lavender. She had said, with perfect gravity, that he might certainly take the shears if he promised not to cut the boxwood. He had laughed, a short, unfamiliar laugh, the first real laugh he had laughed since Easter, and had sat down beside her on the grass, in his clean coat, and had cut lavender under her direction. She had shown him how to snip below the flower head without wounding the stem. Her hands, he had noted, were brown at the knuckles from sun, and stained faintly blue-grey at the second finger from the ink. Her fingernails were cut short and scrupulously clean. They spoke, at first, only of the lavender. Then he said, "Miss Carruthers, might I ask you a question?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Do you always tell the truth?" She paused in her cutting. She looked at him, from beneath the straw hat, with grave grey eyes. "No," she said. "Then why tell it to me?" She considered the answer with the same deliberation she had considered the lavender. Finally she said, "Because you have no one else who will. Your cousin will. I saw him watching you at the graveside. But I think your cousin has been watching you for some months, and saying nothing, and I judged that one more month of silence would not help. You are very certain, Miss Carruthers, for a woman who has known my family for 6 months. I am not certain, Your Grace. I am a clergyman's daughter. I have watched grief for 25 years. I have watched people eaten by grief they were not permitted to own. I wrote my father's sermons for him in the last year of his life, because the grief of our parish would not let him hold his pen. I know the look of a man who is being eaten. I saw you in the morning room in February, when I came with Lady Lavinia to call on your mother. You did not see me. You are not obliged to remember. And I knew then. In February? Yes, Your Grace. Your brother had been dead 3 years and Mr. Whitney 1 month, and you were discussing the price of oats with your mother, and you did not once blink. Julian sat very still on the grass, the shears loose in his hand. Above them, in the limes, a blackbird began to sing its late summer song, not the bright, territorial note of the spring, but the slower, drawn-out evening song, all blue air and dusk. Miss Carruthers, Julian said. Yes, Your Grace. Did my brother die of the same complaint as Henry Whitney? No, Your Grace. Your brother died of a riding fall. Mr. Whitney died of a fever. But your brother was 19, and Mr. Whitney was 29, and you were 23 and 29 respectively when each died, and a man may only carry 2 of those losses in silence for so long before something must be done about it. I do not know, Your Grace, what the proper thing is to do about grief. I know only that permitting yourself to have it is the beginning." She had set down her shears. Her ungloved hands were folded in her lap, small and brown and stained. "Do you hate me for saying so?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "No, Miss Carruthers," he said. "I do not hate you for it. I am astonished by it, and I do not yet know what to do with it, and I may never know. But I do not hate you. I think—" He stopped. He tried the sentence a second way. "I think I shall come back tomorrow, if I may, and help you cut the rest of the lavender." She inclined her head, the small grave bob of the companion who was not a servant and not a lady. "I think Lady Lavinia will be honoured, Your Grace." Then she added, very dryly, "The lavender will be less so. It has survived for 32 years without the assistance of the Duke of Merrow." He laughed the second laugh of the evening. He came back the next day. He came back the day after that. He came back on a Sunday, after church, with the polite, unchallengeable excuse that he was visiting his aunt, and on a Tuesday, with an even more elaborate excuse involving a parcel his aunt had written about, and on a Wednesday, with no excuse at all. By the end of the second week, Lady Lavinia, who was 74, and who had watched 2 generations of Hastings men court women in her garden, had begun to take her afternoon naps with particular punctuality at 3 o'clock. She had also, on the Friday of the second week, rung for her maid, and, in the rattling, imperious voice she used only when she had made up her mind about a thing, ordered that a second sitting be added to the tea-tray whenever His Grace called, so that Miss Carruthers could sit down properly instead of pouring from the sideboard like a governess. Miss Carruthers had objected, quite politely. Lady Lavinia, who had not been objected to since 1798 and was not proposing to begin, had overruled her, quite politely. The second sitting was added. In that second week, Julian rode over to Aunt Lavinia's 7 times. He did not, the first week, touch Alice Carruthers. He did not, the second week, touch Alice Carruthers. He did, however, learn, slowly, as a man learns a language by hearing it spoken, that she was 25 years old, that her father, the Reverend Edward Carruthers, had died in April of the previous year, leaving her an annuity of £44 and no brother, that she had been companion to a Mrs. Felt in Ludlow for 6 months before coming to Lady Lavinia, that she preferred poetry to novels, but read whatever Lady Lavinia wanted read, that she took a walk every morning before breakfast along the lower meadow, regardless of weather, that she wrote, in a hand Lady Lavinia described as frighteningly legible, between 8 and 12 letters of correspondence a day, that she had never, in her 25 years, been further north than Chester or further south than Worcester, that her left stocking had once been darned in a manner his own laundress would have dismissed as amateur, at the ankle, and that when she laughed, which was not often, but which was startling when it happened, she laughed with her whole face, including her eyes, as if the laughter had taken her by surprise. He did not, he noted with dry, private humour, learn these things in order. He gathered them the way a man gathers lavender, a stem at a time along a row, bending down and rising again. And in the rose garden, in that second week, on the Wednesday, Alice Carruthers said something that Julian would afterwards identify as the exact moment the trouble began. They had been speaking of his brother. It was the first time he had spoken of Peter. He had not spoken of Peter to anyone, not once, since the 3 months of formal mourning had ended. He did not know why he was speaking of Peter now. He knew only that Alice had said something about her father, and he had said something back about Peter, and then he had heard himself telling her about the morning Peter had fallen, the horse coming home alone to the stable, the groom's white face, and Alice had not said, "Oh, or how dreadful," or anything of the kind. She had listened. She had looked at him with her clear, grey eyes, and she had said nothing, and when he had finished, she had said, "Your Grace, I wish I had known him. Julian stopped. The roses were browning now. It was the very end of August, and the garden smelled of sun-warmed stone and the last lavender, and faintly of apples from the kitchen orchard. I wish you had, he said. Then he added, because it had been sitting under his breastbone for 3 weeks. He would have liked you. He was 19 when he died. He was what I am not. He was quick. He laughed at things before other people had heard them. He read everything. He made our father laugh, which our father did not otherwise do. He made me laugh, which I had almost forgotten how to do, until you cut lavender beside me in a garden. He would have said, the moment he saw you, there is a girl who says exactly what she means, and he would have liked you for it. Alice was looking down at her hands. Her hands, he noticed with an entirely separate part of his mind, were trembling slightly in her lap. Your Grace, she said, Miss Carruthers, I think we should speak of something else. Yes. He looked at her. He looked at her ungloved hands in her lap, trembling very slightly, at the ink stain on her second finger, at the brown knuckles and the clean short nails, at the small, steady, bowed head under the edge of the straw hat, a woman who always told the truth, a woman who was afraid, now, of what the truth would be. Miss Carruthers, he said. Yes, Your Grace. I will not, he said, press you. Thank you, Your Grace. But I will come back tomorrow. She did not raise her head. She nodded, once, a small nod to the grass. Yes, Your Grace, she said. That evening, Lady Lavinia Hastings, the honourable widow of the 5th Duke's younger brother, Dowager Viscountess of Merrow by marriage, and, in her own estimation, the last living person in her family with any sense, put down her teacup, folded her hands on the arm of her wing chair, and said, Alice, come here. Alice had been reading aloud from Cowper. She set the book down on the arm of the sofa, marked her place with a blue ribbon, and crossed the hearthrug to stand beside her employer's chair. Her hands were steady. She had spent the evening practicing steady hands. Yes, my lady. Sit down. Alice sat on the little needlework footstool by Lady Lavinia's knee. She folded her hands in her lap. A coal fell in the grate and sent up a small, bright shower. Alice, Lady Lavinia said, my nephew has been riding over to my house for the past 14 days. Yes, my lady. He has not ridden over to my house more than 4 times a year since his brother's death. No, my lady. He is in love with you. Alice went pale. It was a very small pallor. Lady Lavinia had made a small life's work of noticing pallors, but it was present. She did not, however, contradict the observation. I am not in a position to encourage him, my lady, Alice said. No, Lady Lavinia agreed. You are not. But I am. Alice looked up. Lady Lavinia studied her companion, the clergyman's daughter, in the 3-season-old dove-grey dress, with the ink stain on her second finger and the light, steady grey eyes, and thought, not for the first time, that there were girls born into ducal families who possessed less of what a duchess required than this one had under her ordinary bonnet. Listen to me, Alice, Lady Lavinia said. I am not proposing to rush you. I am telling you what I see and what I intend to do about it. My nephew has been grieving for 3 years. He has been grieving correctly, in the sense that my sister-in-law approves of the manner, and incorrectly, in the sense that a living man ought to be able to laugh and weep and be cross about the price of oats. You have, in the space of a fortnight, persuaded him to do 2 of those 3 things, and I have some hopes of the 3rd. I am not about to permit my sister-in-law, or her very clever fool of a nephew Cecil, or any combination of the ducal household of Merrow Court, to drive you out of my house before he has finished the work he is plainly doing. Do you understand me? My lady. Further. Alice. If the question ever arises, and it may, my dear, it may, of what dowry you can bring a man like Merrow. You may tell him, from me, that when I die, I mean to leave you this house." Alice stared. "My lady," she said, "you cannot." "I can. I have. The papers have been with my solicitor for a fortnight. I did not quite know why I had done it. I am an old woman, and I am permitted a whim. I know now why I did it. You are not to tell anyone. You are, however, to know it." The fire ticked. The clock struck 10. Alice Carruthers, who had not wept in the garden when the Duke of Merrow had told her about his brother, wept now, very quietly, into her folded hands. Lady Lavinia, who had in fact been weeping privately on and off for 6 years, since the death of her husband, permitted the tears without comment. She handed Alice a handkerchief. She waited. "My lady," Alice said at last, into the handkerchief. "I have not. I have never. Of course you have not. You are 25, and your father was a country clergyman, and you have read too much poetry and not enough malice. Nobody of that description has been in love before. One does not mistake the real thing for the clumsy approximations by which one prepared for it." Alice gave a watery half-laugh. "Now," Lady Lavinia said, "finish Cowper, and tomorrow, when my nephew calls, you will have tea with him on the West Terrace instead of the East. The West Terrace is better lit, and I wish to see his face when he looks at you." 2 obstacles stood between Julian Hastings and any arrangement that might, in the language of country drawing-rooms, come to something. One was his mother. The other was his cousin, Cecil. His mother he had expected. Cecil he had not. His mother, the Dowager Duchess of Merrow, who had been Chatelaine of Merrow Court for 37 years, and who still woke at 6 and ordered the day's dinner from memory, was a handsome, watchful, entirely formidable woman of 61, whose sole remaining life's work, since her husband's death and her elder son's death and her surviving son's inheritance, was to see Merrow married well. In her private vocabulary, married well meant A, to a woman whose family was already at court, B, to a woman whose settlement would clear the minor mortgages on the southern farms, and C, to a woman who would not, in any company, require a footnote to be explained. Alice Carruthers would require at least 2 footnotes. He was prepared for his mother. He was not prepared for Cecil. Cecil Hastings, second cousin, not first, was 34 years old, the son of Julian's father's dead elder brother, by an imprudent second marriage, and, through a quirk of settlement that neither Julian nor Felix had quite understood until they were grown men, the legal heir presumptive to Merrow until Julian produced a son. If Julian died without issue, Cecil got the duchy and the house and the portraits and the Ashwick farms and the London house and the stripes on the library chairs. Julian had always, with the vague, unexamined generosity of a younger brother who assumed his elder brother would live forever, and then, after the fall, with the vague, unexamined generosity of a second son who had not wanted the thing in the first place, been pleasant to Cecil. He had invited him at Christmas. He had been godfather to Cecil's 2 children. He had been seen, by the respectable world, to regard him with affection. Cecil, Julian was beginning to understand, had not quite been of the same mind. Cecil arrived at Merrow Court on the morning of the second Saturday, 3 weeks after the lavender, without warning and with considerable luggage. "I heard you were somewhat pulled down, Merrow," he said, shaking his cousin's hand in the hall, while a footman hauled 2 portmanteaus and a dressing case up the main stair. "I thought I had better come and keep you company. Gussie sends her love. The girls are at the seaside with Gussie's mother, so I am quite at leisure. I shall stay a month." "Is that tolerable?" Julian said, with perfect courtesy. That of course it was tolerable. Cecil, Julian had observed at a dozen long tables over the years, was a handsome man in the way a well-built carriage was handsome. He was clean, expensive, proportionate, and not particularly interesting to look at. He had the Hastings brow and the Hastings nose, and none of the Hastings eyes. His were a pale, flat blue, placed slightly too close together, which had kept his face from beauty in youth, and which, in middle age, lent it a permanent expression of faint calculation. He was not, Julian thought as he led Cecil into the morning room, an ill-natured man. He was a careful man, which was a different matter entirely. "Sit down," Julian said. "Thank you." Cecil sat. "I hear from my mother that you have been at Aunt Lavinia's a great deal." Julian did not sit. He crossed to the window and stood looking out over the sweep of lawn where, that morning, the gardeners were turning the lime walk. He did not speak at once. He considered, in the rather slow manner he had developed in the past 3 weeks, what he wanted to say. "I have," he said, "been calling on Aunt Lavinia 3 times a week. A commendable nephew. She is 74 and increasingly alone. She has no living children." "A commendable nephew," Cecil repeated. "And the companion?" Julian turned. Cecil was sitting in the chair by the fireplace, the chair Henry had liked, the chair Felix had taken on the day of the memorial. He was looking at Julian with the pale, flat blue eyes, and the expression on his face, which was civil and almost apologetic, was at the same time perfectly unmistakable. A man who had travelled 70 miles to deliver a particular message and had now arrived at the particular moment of delivering it. "What of the companion, Cecil?" "Nothing of her, Mero. She is my aunt's companion. It is not, however, universally the case that the companions of elderly ladies become the wives of dukes, and my mother is a nervous woman, and my Aunt Maria, your mother, is a nervous woman, and I promised Aunt Maria I would come and be, shall we say, a cousinly presence. A cousinly presence, only that." Julian looked at him. For a long moment he saw clearly and without illusion the man before him, the careful man with the flat blue eyes, whose wife was at the seaside and whose luggage was upstairs, and he thought, with a clarity he had not quite owned before, that the careful man expected to inherit Mero, and had possibly expected it rather more actively than Julian had noticed, for rather longer than Julian had attended. "Cecil," Julian said, "I am glad you have come." Cecil blinked. He had not expected warmth. "Are you?" he said. "I am. I have been somewhat lonely." Julian smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that had very little warmth in it, and very little malice, and that was, for the first time in 3 years, entirely his own face. "I shall take every advantage of your society. Dinner is at 7. I ride at 4:30. You will join me, I hope." "Certainly." "I shall see you in the stables, then." Julian walked out of the morning room. He closed the door, quietly, behind him. In the hall, he stood for a moment on the black and white checkered marble, the same marble he had walked on at 8, at 12, at 19, at 23, on the day Peter's horse came home alone. And he felt, for the first time since February, something move in his chest that was not grief and was not duty. It was anger, hot, small, and useful. He had a duty to Alice Carruthers now. That was an interesting thought. That was an entirely new thought. He went upstairs to change for the ride. Cecil Hastings had been at Mero Court 3 days when the first of the letters appeared. It was on Julian's breakfast table on the Tuesday morning, tucked under the marmalade pot, in a hand Julian did not recognize. He read it standing. "Your Grace," it began, "a dutiful cousin has felt it proper to acquaint me, as mother to the heir presumptive, that your attentions to a companion in Lady Lavinia's house have become more marked than is consistent with the dignity of your position. I write to you with the deepest reluctance, and in the spirit only of the affection I have borne the Hastings family for 40 years. A duke may pay no attention to the foolish talk of his neighbourhood. A duke's mother must. I beg you to consider the gravity of the impression you are currently making. I beg you further to consider that a young woman of no connections and doubtful means of support might be assumed, by a world less charitable than yourself, to be in some degree imprudent in her encouragement. I have taken the liberty of writing privately to the Dowager Duchess. Your obedient servant, Lady Constance Marsh. Julian folded the letter in half, very exactly, and slid it into his coat pocket. He finished his coffee. He went into the library, sat down at Henry's writing desk, took a fresh sheet of his personal paper, the paper with the Merrow crest at the head and his initials at the foot, and wrote in his own hand, "Lady Constance, your letter of the 6th instant is received. I shall answer it by observing, first, that no young woman in Lady Lavinia's employment has, by any action of hers, encouraged anything improper. Second, that Miss Carruthers is, in fact, the daughter of a clergyman whom Lady Lavinia has personally endowed with her own house. Third, that I am 32 years of age, I am the Duke of Merrow, and I am capable of assessing the dignity of my own position without the assistance of my cousin, Cecil's mother-in-law. I must also advise you, as a matter of particular delicacy, that correspondence of this nature between my cousin Cecil and yourself on the subject of my personal life has reached my attention, and that I consider it impertinent. I shall regard any further letter from you on the subject of Miss Carruthers as an act of hostility toward a lady I hold in the highest regard. Please be advised that I shall act accordingly. I remain, Lady Constance, Merrow." He sealed it. He rang for his valet, who was also his confidential messenger on country errands, and he gave the letter to the valet with an instruction that it be delivered, not by post, but by the hand of the second groom, and placed in Lady Constance Marsh's fingers before dinner. Then he walked out of the library, down the black and white marble of the hall, and into the morning room. Cecil was there, reading yesterday's Times. Cecil looked up. "Merrow," he said pleasantly. "You look fierce." "Cecil," Julian said, "a word." Cecil put down the Times. He stood. He did not, Julian observed, flinch. "A letter from Lady Constance Marsh arrived for me at breakfast," Julian said. "You are acquainted with Lady Constance. She is my mother-in-law. You know she is my mother-in-law. She says in her letter that a dutiful cousin informed her of my attentions to Miss Carruthers. There are only 2 cousins of mine currently within 70 miles of my aunt's house. One of them is Felix, who would cut out his tongue before he gave Lady Constance Marsh an opinion about my personal conduct. The other is you." Cecil was silent. "Cecil," Julian said, very quietly, "tell me to my face that you did not write to Lady Constance about Alice Carruthers." Cecil did not tell him to his face. Cecil took a breath and said, with the patient, reasonable air of a man who had prepared for a difficult interview and was about to conduct it exactly as he had prepared, "Merrow, I am your heir presumptive. I have an interest, a proper interest, a legal interest, in the dignity of the title you hold. I considered it my duty, Cecil, to apprise my mother-in-law." "Cecil," Julian said, not raising his voice, "if you speak one more sentence in that tone in my house, I shall knock you to the floor. I shall then have you removed to the inn at Church Stretton, and your luggage will follow you by cart within the hour." Cecil stopped. He looked, for the first time since Julian had known him, precisely what he was. Not a careful man, but a small one. "I did not think." "You did think. That is the trouble with you, Cecil. You always think. You never feel. Go upstairs. Pack. Leave my house before dinner. If I hear that you, or your mother-in-law, or any person connected to either of you, has spoken in public about Miss Carruthers, I shall remove your allowance from the Ashwick rents with effect from January. Do you understand me?" "Merrow, you cannot," I have. Send your man for the portmanteaus. I shall not see you out." Julian walked out of the morning room. His hands, he noticed, were quite steady. He went, instead of upstairs, out through the garden door and into the kitchen garden, where the apples were coming to their last week of ripeness, and the bees were somnolent in the afternoon heat. He stood by the espaliered pear trees, and he looked, unseeing, at the brick wall behind them, and he breathed. When he had breathed, he walked to the stables. He ordered Marius saddled. He rode over to Aunt Lavinia's. He did not find Alice in the garden. He found her in Aunt Lavinia's small book-room, at the writing desk under the window, copying a letter. She had not looked up as the footman announced him. She had not looked up as Julian crossed the room. When she finished her sentence, she dipped her pen, blotted the paper, set down the pen, and only then raised her head. Her face was very carefully blank. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Carruthers." He closed the book-room door behind himself. It was not strictly the thing to do. "Sit," he said. She sat. He stood before her. He was not a man who paced. He was a man who stood still while the room arranged itself around him. He stood still now. "Miss Carruthers," he said, "I have this morning received a letter from my cousin's mother-in-law expressing concern about my attentions to you. I have answered it. I have further ordered my cousin Cecil out of my house. He will be gone by dinner." Alice's hands had knotted in her lap. "Your Grace, I haven't finished. I do not, Miss Carruthers, require any encouragement from you. I am telling you what I have done. The next thing I wish to do, I cannot do without you." She looked up. "I wish to ask my mother to call upon you here tomorrow," Julian said, "with my aunt in the room. I wish her to sit in this book-room and look you in the face, and I wish you to look her in the face, and I wish this small matter settled between the three of you with the dignity it is owed. I shall not be present. You will be more yourself without me. My aunt, who has eaten my mother for a light supper, twice in my memory, will be present as your ally. Your Grace, I am not your mother's equal. You are not. My mother is a dowager duchess, and you are a clergyman's daughter." He paused. "You are also, Miss Carruthers, the woman I have come to regard as my closest friend in the world, and, it increasingly appears, the woman I shall come, if she will have me, to love. I have some hope that my mother will survive, meeting such a person at her own aunt-in-law's house, with a strong cup of tea and a moderate view of the weather." Alice had gone quite white. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was almost a whisper. "You have not. I haven't proposed to you. I know, I am not proposing to you now. I am asking you for one thing only. That you consent to be called upon by my mother tomorrow afternoon in my aunt's house, with my aunt present, and that you permit my mother to see for herself the kind of woman her son has been riding 4 miles in an evening to sit beside on the grass. After that, after my mother has been here and gone, I shall come and ask you the other question, if I am still the man you wish to hear it from, and if I am not, you shall tell me. Is that—" he hesitated, "an acceptable arrangement?" Alice Carruthers sat for a long moment, with her hands knotted in her lap. Then she said, very steadily, "Your Grace, it is. The Dowager Duchess of Merrow arrived the next afternoon at 4 o'clock in her own carriage, with her own footman, and with the small, tight mouth that, Julian had learned in 32 years, meant she intended, in her quiet way, to destroy any person currently annoying her by the most efficient means available. Lady Lavinia received her on the steps. The two women had not entirely liked each other since 1817, and the matter of the Hastings diamonds, but they had agreed to a form of civilized warfare in which neither openly acknowledged the dislike, and they had maintained this civility for 31 years. "Maria," Lady Lavinia said, Lavinia. How was your journey? Tolerable. Come through to the book room. Alice is expecting you. The Dowager Duchess glanced at her husband's aunt. Alice, she repeated on a rising note. We are to call her Alice. You may call her Miss Carruthers or Alice, as you prefer, Lady Lavinia said equably. I call her Alice because she has lived under my roof for 7 months and has saved my constitution at least twice weekly, and because I am, Maria, 74 years old, and have not lately been in the habit of observing the forms with people I respect. You will call her Miss Carruthers. Come. She led the way into the book room. Alice was standing behind the writing desk. She was wearing the dove-grey dress. She was not trembling. She had folded her hands in front of her. She looked, Lady Lavinia thought with a small private pulse of satisfaction, entirely unremarkable. A clergyman's daughter in a 3-season dress with ink-stained fingers, and also entirely, unanswerably dignified, as if she had arrived at the conclusion that a duchess was a woman like any other woman, only more of her, and had adjusted her expectations accordingly. Miss Carruthers, the Dowager Duchess said. Your Grace, Alice said. She did not curtsy. She inclined her head. Lady Lavinia sat down with a small, carefully pleased creak of silk. Tea was poured. The Dowager Duchess, Lady Lavinia observed over the rim of her cup, took 3 sips of her tea and 2 full breaths before she fired her opening salvo. Maria had always been a careful woman in an engagement. Miss Carruthers, the Dowager Duchess said, I understand that my son has been visiting my sister-in-law very frequently in the last 3 weeks. Yes, Your Grace. And that you have been present at most of those visits. Yes, Your Grace. Miss Carruthers, may I ask you a direct question? Please, Your Grace. Are you an ambitious woman? Alice Carruthers considered the question. She looked for a moment down at the cup of tea in her hands, which was the one with the chip on the rim. The same cup Julian had noticed on a later visit. Lady Lavinia's housekeeper had, he suspected, begun to set it aside for her out of a quiet, companionable sense of belonging. Then she looked up. I have some ambition, Your Grace, Alice said. I am ambitious, for the next 10 years, to be a steady reader to a lady in her old age, and after that I should be glad, if God permits, to be a steady reader to my own books in a small cottage somewhere. I wish to live in a place where I am not afraid of being turned out. I wish to write 20 letters a day in a frighteningly legible hand, as my late employer, Mrs. Felt, used to say. I should not like Your Grace to be a duchess. I am aware of no duchess in the published peerages who reports a strong enjoyment of the office. But if you are asking me, Your Grace, whether I have pursued your son, I have not pursued your son. I told him, 4 weeks ago, in this garden, that I pitied him. He had not expected that, and I had not intended to say it, and we have been, in the weeks since, working out between us what a man does after a woman has said such a thing to him. That is the whole of my ambition in this matter, Your Grace. There was a small, astonished silence. The Dowager Duchess of Merrow set down her teacup. She looked at Lady Lavinia. Lady Lavinia, without allowing a single muscle in her face to move, looked back. Lavinia, the Dowager Duchess said, after a measured pause. Yes, Maria. I do not like this at all. I did not expect you to. She is not at all what I have been imagining. I expect she is not. The Dowager Duchess picked up her teacup. She looked at Alice. Alice had folded her hands again. She was looking, not at the Dowager Duchess, but at the small, steady dance of light on the turkey carpet. She was not afraid. She was simply, as always, at rest within herself, an economy of body that the Dowager Duchess, who had spent 61 years holding herself rigidly upright for the pleasure of other people, suddenly found herself recognizing. Miss Carruthers, the Dowager Duchess said. Yes, Your Grace. Did you really tell my son, in my sister-in-law's garden, that you pitied him? I did, Your Grace. And has he not wept yet? I understand, Alice said carefully, that he has wept twice, Your Grace. Once at his cousin's house in Dorset in September, when an old groom asked him, casually, how he had borne the loss of his brother. And once in his own library last Thursday, when he was writing a letter. A longer silence. The Dowager Duchess looked, for a moment, very tired. I did not know that, she said. No, Your Grace. He has not told you. He did not tell me either. His cousin Felix told me, because he meant to tell you. And I said it was better that he did not. The Dowager Duchess set her cup down and pressed for a single instant the back of her hand against her eyes. Maria, Lady Lavinia said, quietly. Another cup. Please, Lavinia. Another cup was poured. The Dowager Duchess drank her second cup of tea, slowly. Then, with an odd, almost shy quickness, she looked at Alice again. Miss Carruthers, she said, forgive me a rudeness. Will you come over to Merrow Court to dine with us on Friday? I should like my elder surviving son. I should like my son to present you to my own sister. I should like to see you at my own table. Alice Carruthers rose from her chair. She curtsied, a full, correct, formal curtsy, the curtsy the daughter of the Reverend Edward Carruthers of Ludlow had been taught at 12 by her mother, who had once, 35 years earlier, been presented at court. Your Grace, she said, I should be honoured. He proposed to her, not at Merrow Court after the dinner, but 3 days later, in the Rose Walk at Aunt Lavinia's, on an afternoon in the first week of September, when the air had begun, at last, to cool. He did not kneel. He did not make a speech. He said, Alice. She put down the basket of spent rose hips. Yes, Julian. I love you. Yes, Julian. I should like to marry you. Yes, Julian. Then, because he had just, at last, cried in earnest, a small, shaking cry in his aunt's rose garden, in full view of the lime trees and the last bees on the boxwood, she stepped forward and took his hand, and held it, very firmly, between both of her own small, ink-stained, capable hands, and said, It is all right. It is all right. I am not leaving you. Cry. And she did not let go. They were married on the 1st of October in the small parish church at Lavinia's village, with Felix standing as Julian's groomsman, and Lady Lavinia standing, in a manner that was quite against the form, as Alice's, because Alice had no one else to stand for her, and Lady Lavinia had been unable to tolerate the idea of any other person performing the office. The church was filled with the whole village, and with the Merrow tenantry, and with exactly 14 of the Dowager Duchess's most important relations, and with no one from Cecil Hastings' side of the family at all. Cecil, by the 1st of October, had been reinstated at Merrow Court, with a reduced allowance and a written understanding. He and Gussie had attended the dinner at Merrow Court the previous week, with the perfect good manners of people who had learned, belatedly and expensively, what dignity really cost. Gussie, who had grown up under Lady Constance Marsh's roof and had some private opinions about her mother's letter-writing habits, had surprised everyone by embracing Alice in the hall of Merrow Court with a quite spontaneous warmth. Cecil, watching, had looked, for perhaps the first time in his life, like a man who was reconsidering himself. At the wedding breakfast, Lady Lavinia made the only speech. It lasted 40 seconds. She said, I asked Alice to come to me last February, when I was a tiresome old woman, and my previous companion had decamped with my best brooch. I write now, at 74 years of age, that she was the second most useful thing I ever brought to this house in my life. The first was her husband's great-grandfather, whom I married. I give her today to a man whose aunt has outlived more of his family than is strictly decent, and who has the great good fortune to be sustained in her old age by the thought that her nephew has finally done something sensible. Merrow, drink your wine. Alice, drink yours. The rest of you, drink too. She sat down. Julian Hastings, 9th Duke of Merrow, drank his wine. 6 months later, in the first warm afternoon of April, Julian came into the little book-room at Merrow Court, the room his wife had chosen, over the larger drawing rooms, as her working room, and found her at the writing desk under the window. She was copying out a letter. Her second finger was stained blue-grey at the nail. Her hair was pinned back beneath no bonnet at all, in a soft, heavy coil at the nape of her neck. She had grown, in the 6 months of being Duchess of Merrow, not more ornate, but more plainly herself, a woman who moved through her rooms with the economy of a woman who had learned her house and could be trusted to run it. Her inkwell had been refilled that morning. Her pen was steady. On the desk beside her was a cup of tea, which she had allowed to go cold, the cup with the chip on the rim. She had brought it with her, quietly, from Aunt Lavinia's, and had placed it on her desk on the first day of her occupation, and had used it, in the 6 months since, as her personal cup. Lady Lavinia, on being informed, had laughed for 10 minutes. Julian stood in the doorway and watched her. He watched her because, in March, in London, his mother had finally, on her own account, told him that she thought Alice the most unexpectedly remarkable thing that had happened to the Hastings family in a generation, because Felix, on a Thursday 3 weeks ago, had remarked, with the mild surprise of a man confirming an improbable hypothesis, that Julian was again the brother he remembered from childhood, because Lady Lavinia, on the day before, had sent a note from her house saying only, "The boy is restored. Thank you," because Henry Whitney's widow, on a visit at Christmas, had wept a second time, in Alice's arms, and had said she was glad. She was so glad. She had been afraid nobody in the Hastings household had been glad of anything for 4 years. Because Alice Carruthers had looked at him across a rose garden 6 months before, and had told him the truth. She looked up now. Her clear grey eyes met his over the writing desk. "Julian," she said. "Alice, you are watching me again." "I am." She set down her pen. She smiled, the smile she kept for him, the slow, whole-faced smile that in the early weeks had arrived so rarely that he had counted each occurrence. "Have you come to do the accounts with me, Your Grace?" "No, Alice." "Then what have you come for?" He crossed the room. He came round the writing desk. He bent, and he picked up the chipped cup from the edge of the blotter, and he set it carefully on the other side, out of the way of her papers. He took her ink-stained hand. "I have come," he said, "to tell you something." "Yes." "A little over 6 months ago, on the 14th of August of last year, in your garden, I was standing in my aunt's rose walk, and a woman whose name I did not yet know told me that she pitied me. Do you remember?" "I remember, Julian." "You could not have known, Alice, because I could not have told you, because I could not then have told myself that it was the first thing any person had said to me in 3 years that was true. You took it on yourself to say it to me. You are a clergyman's daughter, and I am a duke, and you said the one thing that nobody else would have said that would persuade me to live. I could not thank you then, because I didn't yet understand. I have come now. On the 14th of every month, for the rest of my life, I intend to come into this book-room where you work, and thank you for it." Alice Carruthers, Duchess of Merrow, who had almost never wept until her marriage, and who, in the 6 months since, had wept rarely and well, sat very still at her writing desk. The April light came through the window and fell across her ink-stained hand. "Julian," she said. "Yes." "I will make you a bargain." "Yes." "You will come in here on the 14th of every month, and I will not require you to say a single word of that speech ever again, because it is a foolish speech, and I have heard better. You will come in here on the 14th of every month, and you will sit down in that chair opposite me, and we will drink our tea together, and you will tell me, without speeches, something small you have done in the past month that makes you glad. That, Julian Hastings, is what I should like for the rest of my life. Not to be thanked, to hear you glad. Julian Hastings, 9th Duke of Merrow, who had been a man for whom joy had for 3 years been a technical impossibility, set his other hand over hers on the blotter. "Alice," he said. "Yes, I am glad today," he said. "Tell me. I rode Marius out to the lower meadow this morning. And a lark came out of the hedge. It went up and up. And I watched it, Alice. I watched it go. I did not remember anything. I did not perform anything. I watched a lark. That is what I came to tell you." She lifted his hand to her mouth, and she kissed his knuckles, once quietly, and she set his hand down again upon the blotter, and she smiled up at him. "Julian Hastings," she said, "I love you." "I know," he said. Then he sat down in the chair opposite her writing desk, under the April window, in the book room of Merrow Court, and his wife picked up her pen and went on with her letter, and he did not speak, and she did not speak, and the clock on the mantel, which was the small, gilt French clock that had been in the room since his grandmother's time, ticked on in the spring afternoon, and he watched her work, and he was glad.